kind of wild. Um, yeah. So you may hear, I got two new little kittens, so you may hear them running around and probably potentially knocking things over in the background. Don't mind them. Um, I am hoping that today you leave with some new understanding of scallops here along the coast of Maine. And my biggest goal is just to kind of make you realize how cool scallops actually are and all of the cool things that are happening with scallops in Maine. And actually go ahead and like raise your hand if you have had any of the fresh scallops since now it's scallop season. Anyone had? Yeah, okay, Murphy, nice. Alicia, yes. I can't see everybody, but there's yeah, Joe, nice. Hey, Joe. Um, yeah, so the scallops are in season right now. Make sure to grab some if you can. They are so good, and that's the wild fishery. And yeah, the season will hopefully be going through March. So just an FYI. All right, I'm going to get started. And so the big thing that I'm going to talk about today is kind of larval distribution, but there's a lot of things to get to before that. Um, I got to start my timer here also because I'm quite loquacious. And as most people on this call know, I could just go on and on and on, but I will try to keep myself moving. All right. So first, I'm going to tell you a little bit about why scallops are so special. And then I'm going to give an overview of scallop fisheries and then talk about the two things that I mostly spend a lot of my time doing, which is thinking about and talking about and learning about and studying scallop reproduction and also larval ecology. Which if we don't know about those things, then what are we doing here? Because we need those things to happen to have good, healthy scallop populations. And then I'll close, and there's not really much of a close, but I like to put it on there. So this is kind of where we're headed. So first off, scallops are the second most diverse group of mollusks. This right here is kind of the biology of a scallop. The adductor muscle there is what we eat. There are over 400 species worldwide. 18 of these species are harvested, either through aquaculture practices or wild harvest. They have two dorsally hinged shells. So down there at the flat part, the dorsally hinged shells, the valves, and so bivalve. And then the white adductor is what we eat. We're trying in many other parts of the world, they also eat the gonad, which is kind of the red part there. But we'll talk a little bit more about that later on and why we don't eat so much of it here, but they do in many other parts of the world. So one of the other really cool things that makes scallop so amazing is that they have eyes. And so in this picture, all those little black dots around the shell, those are actually their eyes. And scallops can have up to 300 eyes, depending upon the species. But they're really amazing. So oftentimes they can sense, changes in shadows, changes in light. And this is from a study where they're studying kind of the cones and rods that scallops actually have in these eyes and the different ways that scallops might be able to perceive their surroundings. So really, they can't look at me and say, oh, that's Phoebe, but they can understand that there's something big coming their way and they better close up and try and protect themselves. So it's really cool. And raise your hand if you've ever seen a live scallop, like the whole thing, not just the adductor meat. Okay, good. If you haven't, I would suggest you find one because they're the most charismatic of the bivalves. You're not going to get a mussel to do anything for you. You're not going to get an oyster or a clam to do anything for you, but a scallop will react. And that is oftentimes, well, I guess my lead into this isn't as exciting, but they can swim. And I'll talk about that in a second too. But scallops are monomyarians. That sounds like a really big word, but I point this out because it is the reason that scallops can swim. So in the picture here in A and B, that's a picture of basically a clam on the left and a mussel on the right, which is B. And it shows the distribution, the separation of those two mussels that oftentimes when you're eating them, that's what's left behind, right? Sometimes it can be hard to get scrape that last little bit of mussel out with your teeth. But they have two separate parts of what is essentially their adductor muscle. In scallops, they've evolved to have just one muscle. So they're monomyarians. And that's really important because this one muscle makes them very unique in the bivalve world because it allows them to swim basically their entire lives. So this mussel, if you've ever eaten a scallop, sometimes you might have a little like half moon shaped piece of mussel that comes off of the larger white part. That's actually the vestigial mussel that eventually evolved to be one, as we saw from these two. So all scallop species, this is a picture of all scallop species having it's called the tonic adductor muscle and the phasic adductor muscle. So it's still two separate muscles, but they're together. They've come together. And that's what allows them to swim, which is a really important part of their ecology and a really, really, I think, probably one of the coolest, in addition to their eyes, things about them. Scallops can retain the ability to swim their entire lives. In the background, you can hear Marsden Brewer talking. He's a scallop farmer out of Stonington. But these are all seed scallops. So, you know, they're 1 to 2 inches there. And you can see them start to swim. And it's cool because also they swim forward. So oftentimes you'd think that they would be swimming back, but they actually swim forward. And scallops retain this ability their entire lives. And that's really important because not only are they able to move to find new habitat, maybe find new food, things like that, but it's really important for their adult part of their lives for reproductive purposes. I'll talk a little bit about that. Scallops are found here. Let me get this out of the way. They're distributed from Newfoundland all the way up to down to North Carolina. And so you can kind of see here, these blue areas are where we find our large harvested populations of scallops, but Newfoundland all the way down to North Carolina. So it has a pretty long range. And they're generally found in depths ranging from 18 to about 100 meters. So, you know, 50 down, you know, 30 feet, all the way down to about 300 or 400 feet. But also in shallower inshore waters in Maine and Canada. And so these big aggregations of scallops are called beds. You may have heard like scallop beds, mussel beds, you know, the oyster beds. And so these areas correspond to areas of suitable temperature, food availability, substrate, and oceanography. So it's a pretty wide range to be able to find all of these things to allow scallops to exist in big populations. Now, in terms of what it means for fisheries, so in the Atlantic, the federal sea scallop fishery supports the largest and most valuable wild harvest scallop fishery in the world. So remember, I said there are about 18 species harvested. This is the largest and most valuable wild harvest scallop fishery that we have right here in our United States, which is pretty wild. And if you purchase some scallops, you know, a pound of scallops, those prices can get pretty high sometimes in the what's it called? Supermarket. So it's a pretty lucrative fishery. And again, it takes place from the Mid-Atlantic Bight off of North Carolina up to the Northern Gulf of Maine in federal waters. And it's very economically lucrative. And in 2021, it generated a record amount of $560 million. So it's a big moneymaker. And it serves as a source of income for a lot of fishermen. Here in Maine, our inshore state-managed fishery brought in over $9.3 million in 2023. That's not the highest it's ever been, but it's pretty darn close. It supports around 305 draggers and 31 divers, and it's managed in 3 zones along the coast, shown here in this figure. So zone 1 is purple, and it spans basically the New Hampshire border to the middle of Western Penn Bay. So if you go, I think it's like 3 miles. If you hop on the Rockland Ferry and you're heading out to Vinyl Haven, about 3 miles into that ride, you will cross over, from zone 1 into zone 2 of the state-managed scallop fishery. And so the zone 2 is essentially the rest of the coast, which is pretty crazy to think about. And then zone 3 is Cobscook Bay, which is managed in its own kind of magical little system up there, because Cobscook Bay is its own really magical place. So we have this really economically lucrative, well-established, and healthily managed fishery, wild fishery for scallops. And right alongside that, we have a growing aquaculture industry. So this map here shows the locations of existing aquaculture sites spread along the entire coast. Okay, or we could also say within those wild harvest management zones. So of these 966 lease and LPA sites, 14% of them list scallops as a species to grow. So they may or may not be growing scallops on their site, but they could if they wanted to. So about 14% of them. At this time, and to my knowledge, there are only around 5 farms that are growing at any scale. So really only about 5 farms that are selling it all, which are represented by these red stars. Please speak up if this is incorrect and you know of someone else who is growing and selling scallops. It's hard to actually track down that information. Lots of people are kind of growing scallops just on a very small scale, just to see if their farm can support it, to maybe see if there's a local market that they can sell into, but there's not a lot of people doing it in a big way. So what this number means is that there's a lot of potential. A lot of people are thinking about growing scallops because they're legally allowed to on their farm. But we haven't realized that potential yet because there's only 5 people that are growing them to scale. So it's a new industry, a new kind of technology for aquaculturists to learn about. There's a lot of information transfer happening and a lot of partnership happening with places like Japan. Most of the methods that we use to grow scallops came from knowledge and technology exchanges with Japanese collaborators. And those relationships have been really fostered by a few people in the industry for over 20 years, which is pretty amazing. And scallop aquaculture, as it continues to grow, it's generating more revenue. They grossed $585,000 in 2023, and that was up from the year before in 2022, it was just 250,000. So it is growing. There's a lot more to go. There's a lot of space to fill in here, but it could be potentially really lucrative. And so what we end up with is this really cool overlap of wild and farm scallop populations in certain areas along the coast. And again, if you look at those red stars, especially in Penobscot Bay, and there's a lot of that potential for this overlap to expand along the entire coast if more people actually start growing scallops. And this provides a really unique opportunity. This overlap provides a really unique opportunity to compare populations of wild and cultured scallops, test new methods for monitoring them, and to deepen our understanding of how they might interact and what that might mean, not only for the scallop and its ecology, but also for the people who depend on it. Yeah, okay. So as we've heard, the emerging scallop aquaculture industry, actually, I didn't say this before, but I should say this. So the emerging scallop aquaculture industry relies on wild seed. So one of the big ways that these industries are already interacting is that anyone who's growing scallops in Maine in aquaculture, they're relying on gathering that seed from the wild population. And I'm going to talk a lot more about that a little later on. But just remember that detail. So they relied on seed collection for the wild populations. And there are some specific opportunities of potentially beneficial interactions of these wild and cultured populations, including the potential for larval spillover or passive enhancement from farms or closed areas to potentially support the wild populations. This has been, this is assumed, but we haven't documented this in Maine yet, but they've documented some pretty successful efforts of this in mussel populations in New Zealand. And there's also the potential for post-larval capture, culture, and release efforts or active enhancement to enhance wild populations. So AKA you catch seed from the wild population, you grow it up on your farm, and then you put it back into the wild population once it gets to a certain size to kind of seed that natural wild bed area. And then that feeds back into the potential or feeds back into the wild harvest industry. Again, these are potential benefits that we could see, although none of this is quite happening yet or not documented. That's some of the work that I'm hoping to do in the future that I'll talk a little bit about later. And so a common need towards evaluating these interactions is understanding the larval supply and the reproduction. And actually, I should say the reproduction and the larval supply, because that's the order that I'm going to talk about them in. But it's kind of like chicken or the egg, right? But I'm going to start with reproduction. So getting on to one of my favorite things that I spend so much of my life actually talking about, thinking about, and researching, scallop reproduction. Scallops are sexually dimorphic. which means that you can tell males from females. So in this picture here, it's tiny on my screen. I hope it's larger on your screen. But the red, as I pointed out before, those are the female gonads. Sometimes people call them coral. And then this right here, the white chunk, those are male gonads. So they're sexually dimorphic. You can tell the difference between them. This is not true for all scallop species, but thank heavens it's true for our species, which makes a lot of the work that I do much easier. And they're also called broadcast spawners. So that means that they just shoot their eggs and sperm up into the water column and they hope for the best. And so if you remember, I mentioned that scallops are swimmers, and it's really important that they swim as adults because generally they're kind of loners. They like to have their space. They're a little bit grumpy. They don't want to be crowded by their friends unless it's time to reproduce. So when it's actually time to reproduce, they swim. They, don't use this muscle a lot, but when they do, they use it for good purposes. They swim to get nearer to their conspecifics, to their males or females, whatever they need, so that they can have a higher chance of their gametes interacting and a higher chance of larvae or their eggs successfully being fertilized by males and females being closer together. So you actually find them in these big clumps nearer to each other when spawn time comes around. And this is pretty wild. Females can release up to 270 million eggs at once. That's pretty wild. And these fertilized eggs, they actually fall to the bottom for the first 24 hours. And then they spend the next like 30 to 45 days up in the water column. So they generally spawn in late summer. This figure here shows the spawning pattern of a population in Canada, which is very similar to our spawning patterns here. So these are the months of the year. So June, July, August, you can see that there's a big spawn. This GSI is gonadosomatic index, which is essentially the percentage of the gonad, the percentage of the entire animal that is taken up by the gonad at this point in time. So you can see that this is kind of late spring, this is winter. In the winter, it's really low. That GSI is really low. As you start to build into the spring, into the summer, there's a peak and then a precipitous decline. And so that means that they're spawning. So scallops generally spawn in late summer here in Maine, also in Canada. As you move further southward in their range, they actually have two spawns. One of them normally happens in the fall and one normally happens in the spring. But this is the pattern that we generally see here in the North Atlantic. And it's really important to understand reproductive investment and timing in order to inform our understanding of those resulting larval dynamics. So this here is the life cycle of scallops. We've had a very brief overview of spawning and reproduction, but now I'm just going to briefly walk you through a bit of the larval ecology because larval dynamics can be really complicated. And the one larval ecologist that I work with who was on my PhD committee, he talks about himself as a dying breed all of the time because no one wants to study larval ecology because it's so complicated and complex. Just think about it. These tiny, less than a millimeter, millions, billions of tiny little millimeter less than things just sifting around at the whim of the ocean. And really almost everything in the ocean starts as larvae. So just think about that. Almost every single thing that you know of in the ocean, minus whales, minus sharks, but most fish are eggs. I mean, just think about anything that you like in the ocean or anything that you eat from the ocean. Most of it started as tiny itty bitty little larvae. So that continues to blow my mind. Yeah, way cooler than land, just saying. Anyway, all right, so briefly, what's happening during these larval stages? So there's our adult. We just talked about broadcast spawning. Again, males and females, they shoot their eggs and sperm up into the water. As they've hopefully swum near each other, fertilization happens. After 24 hours, they've already moved through essentially two stages of development, which are the externally fertilized egg and the trochophore stage. So they've already started to move into what their scallopy life is going to be like. And again, they sink down to the ocean, sink down to the bottom, spend 24 hours there, and then they start migrating up into the water column. Within 3 days, they start to look like a shelled being, the straight hinge larvae there. They're still super tiny, about 110 micrometers. That's 1/10 of a millimeter. All right. And then they spend the next 20 to 30 days up in the plankton as a petavelliger larvae. So peta means foot, right? And so they start to have a foot like you see in many bivalves, right? If you've ever gone chasing clams, if you've ever gone like digging clams, I normally am not successful. I chase them because they have that foot that they use to move down into the sand with. Scallops only really use that at the beginning of their life. They lose it and it becomes a vestigial foot, a very tiny foot that's actually attached to their gonad, which is kind of weird. But they only have that for the very beginning of their life. And then they start to settle out and they're as these little juveniles, which can be almost a millimeter. And then they start to grow into really looking like a scallop with those little flat hinges at the bottom. These two little corners are called ears. And that's what they pretty much look like for the rest of their life, because that's what the big scallops look like. So that happens once a year. And scallops can live up to around 20 years. And again, the bigger they get, the more eggs they have. So females that are still reproducing, that are big scallops, they're putting out a lot of gametes. So you can have tons of larvae, but it doesn't always result in tons of adults. Oh, I guess I could have used all those helpful circles that I forgot about. But so once fertilization occurs, they're negatively buoyant. I went through this. They spend the next 30 to 45 days up in the water column. They transition through all these larval stages. And then also remember that I said that scallops that are being grown in aquaculture are caught in a spat bag. They're caught from the wild population, and they're caught in something called a spat bag, which I have right here. So this is a spat bag. This is what a spat bag looks like. I'm not sure. Can you guys see me or no? Probably
Yeah.
not.
Yeah, we can
Oh, you
see
can?
you're just small.
Okay, I'm gonna stop sharing just for a hot second. So this is a spat bag, and it's this really cool, just a bag about this long, about half a meter long, and it's this really fine mesh on the outside. It's less than a millimeter wide mesh, and then on the inside, the spat bag is stuffed with this. This is called Netron, and it's like a thicker, wider mesh plastic. And the bag gets stuffed with multiple pieces of this. I don't have multiple pieces of this because I took my other teaching tool to my other lab. But it's all stuffed up like this. And this is what we put out in the water column to catch baby scallops. So they're out there in those tiny little larval stages. Somehow the ocean directs them through this bag. They run into the blue netron on the inside and they think, this is a nice little spot to maybe post up for a little bit and grow. Little do they know, if they grow too much, they won't be able to get back out of the bag. So any scallop grower uses spat bags or buys their spat from someone else that puts out spat bags. We're going to learn a lot more about spat bags. They're very cool. There's a lot more to say about them, but that's how the wild seed is caught, or that's how the baby scallops are caught from the wild population to be grown up on aquaculture sites. Oh, where am I now? Now I'm okay. There we go. Oops. No, wrong thing. Okay, there we go. All right. So yeah, we're still getting all of that baby seed from the wild industry. Many other bivalve industries have hatcheries for their scallops. So if you know Mook Sea Farm, right? If you live down on the Pemmico Peninsula, Mook is over there in Walpole, just before the Darling Center. Or on the other side, over in Bremen, you have Muscongas Bay. Those are hatcheries, and they're growing baby oysters mostly. They're doing some other species, but there's no hatchery for sea scallops. That is in the works at the Darling Center and at other places, but it's pretty hard to do because they have that long larval period. So it's really important to have a clear understanding of these larval dynamics and these reproductive dynamics. Oh, yeah. And also, I should say that it's greatly influenced by our circulation patterns. I'm assuming some of you are sailors on this call. You probably understand that the circulation along the coast of Maine can be pretty wild, push you in different places. It does that to anything living in the ocean, especially these itty bitty tiny little things. So if a scallop spawns down east, these larvae have a lot of time to move along the coast or be pushed out into the Gulf of Maine. But after they've been transported to wherever they're going to go, they either settle out on a good habitat to grow up and hopefully be recruited into the fishery, or we catch them in our spat bags. We've already seen that. So understanding the reproductive processes of adult scallops can inform our understanding of larval dynamics, both of which are really important to the future success of wild and cultured industries. So I'm going to talk about two different projects where we've been looking at this. First one that talks about the reproduction, and then second one that talks about the larval distribution. So this is from part of my PhD dissertation that I just finished about 2 months ago. And so we're comparing energy investment in farmed and wild scallops. So really looking at what biological impacts might aquaculture have on scallops. And this work would not be possible without industry collaborators. That will be a continuing theme across both of these projects, and I will continue to press that point. The top two pictures are Marsden and Bobby Brewer in their fabulous Hawaiian shirts. If you ever get to go out on the boat with them, they always look really good because they're always dressing up and looking like they shouldn't be pulling traps. They should be like having a cocktail down on the dock or something. But Marsden and Bobby are really, I call Marsden the grandfather of scallop aquaculture. He's really brought scallop aquaculture to where it is today. He's been growing scallops for over 20 years, catching them in spat bags for over 20 years. And he and Bobby are really huge knowledge holders in this industry. And then below are Hannah Twombly and Connor O'Neill. They're from Maine Island Aquaculture on North Haven. They're a young couple. They just got their lease expansion approved. So they're going to be doing more growing of scallops and more growing of kelp. And both of these farms allowed us to access, well, first they decided to partner with us. They let us purchase some of their product from them to use for our experimental deployments. And they helped us access their farms every week for about 6 months in each of those 3 years. So anything that you see here would not be possible without them. And Marsden always had scallops to eat on the boat too. So it was always a plus. So big point, industry collaborators, very important. I want to just kind of highlight some of the differences in the environments between cultured, farmed, and wild scallops. So first of all, on an aquaculture farm, this is a really rough picture of what you see is the line, okay, the long line that sits around maybe anywhere from 10 to 20 feet below the surface of the water. There's a long line that these lantern nets, those are the black nets here that have all these different levels. Imagine them that they're filled with scallops. So they're hanging down below the surface and then they're hanging vertically in the water column. All right. In the lantern net, scallops are in high densities. These nets are not touching the bottom. So there's limited predator interaction because predators can't get up and into the nets. All right. So those are our farm scallops. Our wild scallops, it's a different picture. They're just hanging out on the bottom, right? So they're on the benthos or on the bottom of the ocean. They're in much lower densities. Remember, I told you that they're kind of, they like to be loners. So they like to spread out a lot unless they're spawning and want to come together. And they're accessible to predators throughout their entire lives. So even when they're these tiny little babies settling out, they're accessible to predators. So these two different environments can have very different food, flow, and light regimes, which can impact the biology of scallops in different ways. And so that's the big question that we're asking is, are there biological differences between wild and farm scallops? So the way that I looked at that is that we accessed the North Haven farm up at Connor and Hannah's, the Stonington farm over at Marsden and Bobby's, and then also partnered with the Hurricane Island Center for Science and Leadership to use their experimental research farm to collect these scallops. So we collected scallops from June through October, from 2020 to 2022, and we recorded the shell height, so how tall the shell is, and then we weighed the shell Um, all of the goopy stuff inside, remember from that very first picture, all of the parts of the organism inside that are soft, we weighed that. And we weighed the gonad, so the male and female gonad, and the adductor muscle, the meat part that we weighed those separately to understand how much energy they're putting into the gonad and how much energy they're putting into the meat in relation to everything else. And we also collected some environmental data. So on the left here, we have the part of the scallop that I'm going to be talking about that this data represents highlighted. So there's a circle around the adductor or the meat, the gonad, and the viscera, all of the soft stuff together. So that's what these pictures represent. And so this shows here the morphometric comparisons. So the adductor weight of wild, which are the light boxes. You can also see that along the bottom here. And the farmed scallops, the dark boxes. Okay. And the asterisk denotes a pair that's not significantly different. So the weights, what we're learning, what this shows us is that the meat mass of farmed scallops, again, the dark boxes, are significantly heavier than the meats of wild scallops in these three different size classes. Same thing goes for the gonad, except for this smaller size class. The gonads of farmed scallops, the dark boxes, are heavier than those of their wild counterparts, and also total viscera. So generally, what farmed scallops are putting more energy into their soft tissue. They're putting more energy into that muscle, that meat, and they're putting more energy into those gonads. When we look at shell weight, we see a different relationship. We see that the shells of wild scallops, again, the light boxes, are significantly heavier than those of farm scallops. So same figure. This figure just shows that information in a different way. Yellow is farmed, and green is wild scallops. So again, oh, I'm sorry. Green is farmed and yellow is wild scallops. My bad. But again, the farmed are meatier scallops. They have the potential for greater reproductive output because they have a larger gonad. And generally, they're putting more energy into their body tissue. And perhaps because wild scallops have those significantly larger shells or heavier shells, they're potentially allocating more energy to defense. Now, remember those two environments, scallops in aquaculture, they're up in those nets. They don't have to worry about predators. Scallops down on the bottom in the wild, they're accessible to predators their entire lives. So perhaps they have thicker shells, heavier shells, because they have to worry about defenders more. So something else that we found is that farming does not affect spawn timing. Now this figure here shows the dates in the boxes are the dates that spawning occurred in wild and cultured populations. So the wild populations are the little red triangles, and the blue circles are the farm populations. And those dates, they may be a little bit hard to read, but there's not much difference in spawn timing between wild and cultured populations. Generally, they're within 2 weeks of each other at each of those areas. And what this shows is that peak spawning, as you can see by this dashed line, occurs very closely with the peak temperature that's happening in the water column. So temperature seems to be a pretty good indicator of spawn timing as well. And oh, this should be moved, but I'll just focus on this one. So farming doesn't affect the timing of spawning start, but it might affect spawning synchrony. Oh, and this is actually, this figure isn't supposed to be here. So sorry, everybody, but you can't see the point that I'm trying to make because it's in the figure behind it. But just remember that. Remember that that wild and farm scallops may not be, they may be spawning at similar times, but in the entire population, scallops in farmed populations, they're more in sync with each other. Just remember that detail. It's a hard one to see in this figure. And the reason that we think that this is happening is because, like I said, scallops are densely clustered in those nets. And so this clustering potentially influences the synchrony of scallops. So the closer scallops are, the quicker everyone gets that message. Oh, it's time to let our gametes go. So because they're in all those big nets, they're thinking about letting the reproduction happening basically quicker because that message is getting out there quicker. So in farming, scallops alter their energy allocation. They put more investment in tissue and less in shell. And again, the working hypothesis is that this is because of lower predation pressure and a lower pressure for those potentially limited resources like food or flow. And this is really good news for the farming economy. So aquaculture could potentially result in less search time, right? You're not having to go out there and drag or dive to catch your scallops. And when you do grow them, you're getting a bigger product. You're getting a larger meat that you can sell sooner. When you're thinking about life events, so spawn timing or spawn synchrony, farming does not affect the timing of spawn start. Both of the spawning of farm and wild scallops coincided with peak temperature. And there's not really any effect of farming on this life event of timing. But perhaps it does increase synchronicity. The peaks in the farm spawning were taller and narrower, meaning that scallops in farm populations got that message quicker that it's time to start spawning, which increases the potential for successful fertilization. And again, it's perhaps of that clustering, those high densities on scallop aquaculture farms that might increase the synchronicity. And what that means is that farming might enhance reproductive investments and potential larval output. So we might be seeing increased larval output from farms, but we still need to test that. So there's a lot more work to do here. So understanding the impacts of farming on genetic connectivity of the population along the entire coast, the importance of farms to enhancing wild populations in a passive manner just by providing larval supply. And then also potentially, because we're catching from wild populations and moving spat and wild scallops around the coast, it might be increasing the genetic diversity of these populations. But these are all questions to be answered in the future, some of which I'm working on at the Darling Center currently. So now I'm going to scooch into the larval dynamics and what this all might mean for larval dynamics, because now we know a little bit more about the reproductive ecology. We know when scallops spawn, we know how they spawn, we know that on farms it's happening. Scallops are putting more energy into reproduction, and we're thinking about what this might mean for the wild population. So we still need to expand our understanding of larval dynamics along the Maine coast. So this next project I'm going to talk about, again, is a massive collaboration, literally along the entire coast, from Casco Bay all the way down to Millbridge, Narraguagus Bay. So how might we think about aquaculture and wild scallop industries together and identify areas of research that can benefit both? This is one of them. This is a partnership between Maine Center for Coastal Fisheries, Colby College, Hurricane Island Center for Science and Leadership, and now UMaine. Again, this would not be possible without industry collaborators. We work with scallop fishermen and farmers along the entire coast of Maine to make this possible. This is our third year that it's happening. And we also work with local organizations like Maine Oyster Company, Chipman's Wharf and Millbridge that allow us to do the processing of all of our research and all of our spat bags that we put out for this project. So it's been a huge lift for so many people along the coast and would not be possible without those industry partners, because we use their boats, we use their time, and they keep an eye on the scallops and everything, all of our bags. Even right now, you know, they're out there checking an eye on all of our gear that we have out. So the goal of this project to understand larval supply is to first evaluate the spatial and temporal variability in larval supply. So what are the differences along the coast and over time that we might see in larval supply? Also to develop a low-cost replicable monitoring protocol that relies on and also bolsters the knowledge and puts forward the knowledge of fishermen and farmers, and to engage industries in the research process, to strengthen the relationships and knowledge sharing between fishermen and farmers, and also to engage students in this process, specifically high school and undergraduate students in the scientific process. So this has been, like I said, this is like the third year of this project. I see I have some random spat bags that I've put in front of Alex Todd there. But we have these 4 transects along the coast. So the first transect is here in Casco Bay. The second is basically in Muscungus Bay and out beyond Monhegan. The third is Jericho and Blue Hill Bays here. And the fourth is Narraguagus Bay down off of Millbridge. So this was our first year, and we stayed within state waters. And in our second year, oh, I'm sorry. So in each of these sites, we deployed 2 spat lines. So this is what a spat line looks like. This is a line. From the surface, it looks very much just like a lobster trap. There's just a buoy floating at the surface. There's an anchor on the bottom. And then you have bags attached to the line for around 20 to 30 feet above the bottom. So we have 10 bags on each line, and each of these spots is where we have set out bags to collect those baby scallops. And again, in the first year, it was only in state waters. In the second year, we added sites in federal waters, so outside that 3-mile limit. And again, 2 lines at each of these sites with 10 bags. So in each of these transects in 2024, we have 7 sites. Each site has 2 lines with 10 bags. So we have 140 bags at each of these sites. That's a lot of scallops. That's a lot of bags is what I should say first. It's a lot of bags, which I'll get to. And the way that we did that is that all of these sites were picked with fishermen. So we had meetings with these guys up and down the coast and said, where are you interested in collecting data about larval supply, and where might be some good places to put our bags? And so all of these sites were picked by fishermen and deployed. All the gear was deployed by them. So this is what a gear deployment looks like. This is out on Jim Watton's boat. So those are the spat lines. You see it pushed off the back of the boat. The anchor's in the water. They have some floats in the middle to help keep those bags up off the bottom. And then all that line goes out. I think our deepest line is in about 340 feet of water. So we've put lines in deep water and in shallow water. And then we retrieve them again from fishermen's boats. This is Jason Day's boat out helping us retrieve some of our lines out on Hurricane. And you see the bag coming back over. You can see some of the biofouling that's happening, right? So it's not just scallops that settle in those bags. There's all kinds of things that settle in those bags. Oh, I already played that. Oh, great. 2 of those. And then again, I mentioned that we then take all those lines. They're brought into the various places where we're processing them. This is in Stonington at one of the lobster processing plants. This is down in Phippsburg, and this is also inside at Phippsburg, where it was blowing about 20 miles an hour outside, and it was 15 degrees. So we were very, very cold. They let us do things inside, which was awesome. We bring the lines in, and we go through this process of first, we rinse all of the bags into a garbage can full of seawater. And that's what you get after rinsing all of those bags into a garbage can of seawater. I'm going to play it again because it's basic. It looks just like a bunch of mud, but you can imagine all the other things that you're catching, right? So first, we have to essentially rinse that off again and again and again. And then we pick out all of the things that are found in that bag besides scallops. And we put them through this series of little sifters. That's a lot of scallops right there, actually. It's a pretty clean bag. And so then we sift them through these different mesh sifters to get what is essentially a clean chunk of scallops. And these scallops, these sifters allow us to select out the large scallops from the medium baby scallops all the way down to very, very tiny itty bitty scallops, which are less, those are about a 0.5 millimeter. So they're really, really tiny. So we get all these different size classes within these bags as well. And then what we're looking for are all of these really cute little baby scallops, looking so adorable, hanging out, waiting to be counted. And this is a better view of the process. There's Lucy sifting through some of the scallops. This is in one of the processing plants. There's Jules, she's going through. These guys are picking the scallops off of that blue netron with tweezers. Okay, so it takes us about a month to process all of those bags. So it takes about a week for each transect to be processed. It's pretty wild to think about. So here are some results. This is the second year that we have 2 years of data. All of our bags are in the water for a third year. First thing I want to say is that gear loss is an issue. Remember those storms that we had last year, right? Those 2 massive storms that decimated the entire coast. They decimated some gear in our project as well. So in the first year, you can see there are differences along the coast about how much we deployed and how much were retrieved. So we had 60% retrieval in Casco in 2023. That went down. We increased our retrieval in Muscungus. We increased our retrieval in Blue Hill and Jericho, and we basically stayed the same in Narraguagus. But gear loss is an issue. There's a lot of things to contend with out there, and one of them is definitely losing things to the ocean, which is hard, which also means that we have lost data. So this here is showing the total estimated spat per line, or total estimated spat in each of these areas. So the blue shows 2023, and the red shows 2024. And the big thing to notice here is that those spat counts in each of these transects went down in 2024, except for Imiscongus. And I think that that's an artifact of us retrieving 60 bags in 2024 while retrieving 10 in 2023. So it looks like 2023 was a better settlement year for baby scallops in comparison to 2024, at least in our transect areas. This is going to be a really hard one to see, but this essentially shows across the bottom, you have the inshore sites, A, G is the R, the offshore sites. And you can see that same pattern of increased settlement in 2023, which are the blue, in 2024, the orange. But also you see a general pattern of increased spat being offshore, at least in these 2 areas. There's a lot more work to do here, but we suspect that as you go offshore, you're catching more spat. As you get deeper, you're catching more spat, but there's still more analysis to do. This also shows that as you, the deeper the water, the more spat you catch. So spat count on the y-axis and line depth. So as your line depth increases, you also get an increase in that spat count. Again, more work to do because we only have 2 years of data, but we think that there's a relationship between depth and spat settlement. And then this is just a figure because we did put temperature loggers on all of those lines. So it's a little hard to read. And again, we're just getting started with this analysis, but you can see some differences from inshore to offshore of those different temperature regimes. And you can see differences in temperature between sites. So this is West Casco, this is Muscungus, this is Blue Hill and Jericho, and this is Narraguagus. So you see differences in lowest temperatures, you see differences in peak temperatures, and we still have a lot more to do here, but we're hoping to relate temperature also to those spat counts in the future. I did not do the numbers, but I was trying to calculate the numbers of hands that had touched spat over the past 2 years to make this project possible. And I couldn't figure it out because I couldn't get all the numbers of the students, but it's over 150 pairs of hands have made this project possible. And a lot of those have been with students. We engaged with multiple high school and middle school classes and undergraduate students from UMaine and Colby College and Bates College over the 3 years of this project. And it wouldn't be possible without all of these hands doing this work. So not only sorting scallops, but also building spat bags. Lots of hurricane students too. So the takeaways from this project is that gear loss is an issue. There's high interannual and spatial variability. So the variability in spat count between years and also along the coast is very, very different. There's a potentially interesting relationship between depth and spat abundance. And we have really high spatial environmental variability along the entire coast. And so what does this mean for the future of the industry and how we can think about monitoring scallops in the future? That's a big question, and we need to think more deeply about it. So next steps, we are going to be retrieving all of our gear in April or May. If anyone's interested in helping to sort spat and you're really good at picking tiny things off of other tiny things, please let me know. We'd love to have you. We want to engage more industry members and to really continue to expand participation in this project. We're doing some enhancement studies, so some reseeding studies, and we'll be, like I said, doing a lot of data analysis in the coming year to look at all 3 years of data, not only our spat counts, but also the environmental data that we collected. So final thoughts are that understanding adult and larval ecologies is really important, and working with industry is a must. So in the adult world, the farm scallops have the bigger meats and the bigger gonads. Again, that means the larger products for farmers and more potential larval supply from farms. But there is still work to do in monitoring reproduction along the entire coast. The project that looked at this was only in Penobscot Bay. Those spawn timing differences are very different in Casco Bay. They spawn anywhere from 2 weeks to a month earlier than our populations in Casco. And we don't know when the populations down east spawn because those have never been monitored. And when we think about the larval project, deeper water gets more spat. And so far, settlement is variable even within sites. So that inshore to offshore variability. And we need to think a little bit more deeply about the sources of these spat. If you remember, there were those different sizes of baby scallops that we were getting and while we were sieving them. Are those scallops coming from different places? Are they coming from different spawns that happen along the coast? Are they coming from genetically different populations? We don't know. Those are some big questions being left. Forgot all those. There are so many people to thank in this and lots of funding that came in. So lots of fishermen, lots of organizational partners, lots of the processing locations, and the science advisors for all of these projects, really important. And thank you for listening. And these are other people that are really important to the process. This was the Hurricane Island research team that did a ton of not only the scallop dissections for the reproduction work, but also a ton of sorting for the larval supply work. And if you have any questions, want to talk gonads or spat, feel free to send me an email. And that's it. I hope you're not all sleeping.
Definitely not. That was amazing. Phoebe, thank you. Folks, if you have questions for Phoebe, you have 2 options. You can take yourself off mute and ask Phoebe directly, or you can put it in the chat box and I'm happy to read that question.
And I'm going to stop sharing, but I can put it back up if needed to look at something.
Phoebe, you were talking at the beginning about the 5 folks that grow and sell. What are the names of those either companies or organizations?
Great question. Penn Bay Farm Scallops are Marsden and Bobby.
Okay.
Main Island Aquaculture are Hannah and Connor. And I believe that they're mostly selling just on North Haven, but you can also look at Vertical Bay. Vertical Bay sells Andrew Peters, he sells in Belfast. And then also Bay Lady Scallops. She's on, well, her site is off of Swans Island. And she is starting to sell in local areas up there too. But those are the 4 that are really selling right now. The 5th Star, they're not sure if they're going to be selling this year.
Cool. Have you been to Japan to study scallops?
I haven't, but I'm really hoping that I can go over the next 3 years.
Cool.
You haven't talked much about predators, but if I were a predator, I'd love to get through that little hole into the spat bag.
Yep.
Do you get any predators in the spat bags?
Yep, we do sometimes. Sometimes we get sea stars that settle in there with the scallops. And so the bags have been out there for so long that when you open up the bag, there's hardly any scallops left and there's just a couple of big fat sea stars. So sea stars are a big predator on scallops, especially in spat bags. But as scallops get older, there are other natural predators, larger predators for, kind of scallops that are anywhere from 1 inch to 2, maybe even 3 inches. Lots of crabs and lobsters will eat scallops.
And the other question would be, do you get biological growth on the outside that would interfere with the little microorganisms that the scallops want to eat?
Yeah, definitely. So both the spat bags and the lanternets get a fair amount of biofouling. It depends upon where the spat bags are. You know, some different areas have different amounts of biofouling, or living organisms that settle. Biofouling is living organisms that settle on the gear, and we do get a lot of that. And actually, I see that Aaron Adams is on the call. I'm working with Aaron on a project. Aaron has developed uh, a like a compostable, naturally degrading oyster bag that we're using to test to see if we can decrease the amount of biofouling on lanternets by essentially creating a sock that the biofouling will occur on the sock. The sock will naturally degrade over time. And rather than farmers having to wash their lantern nets, it will just fall off naturally and just essentially decompose in the system without putting any plastic or anything bad back into the system.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Thanks for the question, James.
Phoebe,
And yeah, check out Aaron Adam, Ocean Farm Supply.
Phoebe,
Thanks, Phoebe.
Phoebe, are the predators different from the farmed ones versus the wild ones?
Yeah, I mean, unless you put predators into your lantern nets from your spat bags, you're really probably not going to have a predation issue. Because those lantern nets are up off the bottom, right? They're hanging vertically in the water column. Crabs, lobsters, sea stars, they can't actually get up to them. So there's really very few predators in lantern nets. What you really have to worry about in your lantern nets is overcrowding. Scallops don't like to be crowded, so you have to keep around 20 to 30% coverage of the bottom, of essentially the surface area of that lantern net, so that they don't essentially kind of kill each other. They can cut each other is what happens.
And Phoebe, how far off the coast of Maine do scallops grow? Do they go out 50 miles?
Yeah, definitely. The federal fishery happens out in George's Bank. So that's where, yeah, in the federal fishery, or up oh gosh, I'm forgetting the name of it. But yeah, George's Bank, that's the offshore federal fishery happens way out there. But our inshore fishery here all happens within the 3-mile state line. So most of the scallops that you're eating right now, those are all coming from your local guys catching them within these state waters, which is really cool.
And
Phoebe,
go ahead.
go ahead. Phoebe, I'm curious why you're not working in Cobscook Bay. It would seem to me the oceanographic circumstances are just ideal for your project.
I know. It's hard to find, well, there's no growers up there right now, at least no scallop growers. But over the next 3 years with my postdoc stuff, Jim, I'm trying to figure out how to incorporate something up there. The very least set some spat bags, because it's the conditions in Cobscook and kind of the dynamics in Cobscook are, I would say, most similar to the dynamics that we see in like Japan in some of the really successful, like Mutsu Bay, some of the really successful operations over there. So no one's really growing there yet. And I also think that because Cobscook is shallower, that I don't know this, but I'm assuming that it may be harder to have a farm site there, but it's hard to find people to talk to. But I've reached out to Chris Bartlett about it. But if you know anyone also, Jim, tell me.
Not sure anymore.
Phoebe, I have a couple questions from the chat box.
Yeah.
Would there be any negative impact if farm scallops were to escape and breed with live scallops or non-farm scallops?
Yeah, great question. Big concern in some aquaculture industries, because our farm scallops all come from wild seed right now. They're not genetically different. They're not being fed antibiotics or anything like that, which is a concern of people. They just sit out there in the water column just like they would filter feeding. They're spat that came from the wild population. They've not been genetically modified. They're not being fed anything different than their wild counterparts. They're just being put in some gear and put up in the water column. So really good question, and really important thing to know about specifically wild grown scallops, or I'm sorry, aquaculture grown scallops. They are very similar to their wild counterparts, just grown in a different way.
And then, Phoebe, can you eat the scallops that are on the boat raw, just like an oyster?
Oh, yes, you can. Except you cannot eat the whole scallop, or you should not eat the whole scallop unless you are with someone that has had recent testing. So scallops, you know, we can eat the whole oyster, we can eat the whole mussel, we can eat the whole clam. Scallops are, as I said, they're very cool and they're really good at retaining toxins that might be found naturally in the things that they filter feed. So you know how sometimes there are toxic blooms that you'll hear about and they'll shut down the oyster harvest or the clam harvest. It opens back up in a few days once those blooms have passed and oysters have had the opportunity to depurate or essentially get those toxins out of their system. Scallops are really good at retaining toxins. And the only place that they don't retain toxins is in the meat. So they retain toxins in all those other soft parts of their body. So that's why we don't really eat the whole scallop here, is because they're so good at holding on to those toxins. Our species is. Other species in the world, they're not as good at it, and they may not have as many kind of naturally occurring toxins, which are just part of the food that scallops eat, that they're retaining. So you might go to France, you might go to Spain, and you're eating the whole scallop. We only eat the meat. But yes, if you ever get the chance to eat a raw scallop shucked fresh right there, definitely do it. It's so delicious.
Phoebe, I have a question.
Yeah.
We spent a lot of time in South Carolina, and they have these oyster banks that they want the shells back once you've eaten the meat. Do you do that with scallop shells as well? Like Cape Romaine, they take them to put back in the beds.
Yeah. Yep. So a lot of times, that is because they're trying to essentially create like oyster reefs where more oysters will recruit to. And the thing with scallops is that most of the time you're not getting a scallop with a shell, right? You're just buying just the meat. And that's because in the fishery, in our state managed fishery, and also in the federal fishery, in most cases, they are required to shuck the scallop at sea and throw all of the shells and all of the rest of the viscera, except for the meat, back right there. So it's not allowed to hit land at all. So we really don't have a lot of scallop shells that are coming back to land. Now with scallop aquaculture, that is changing. And most people do, you know, throw their shells right back into the water. Scallops don't settle or kind of congregate as oysters do, like on reefs. But there is some question around, you know, are scallop shells a potential signal for scallop settlement of larvae? I don't think that has actually been shown, but it has been shown in other bivalve species, which is why they do it for oysters and to try and build back up the reefs as well.
Thank you.
Yeah, great question.
Phoebe, why is the scallop shell a symbol for traveling pilgrims?
Bobby, that's a great question. I don't know. You tell me.
I don't know.
But actually, I was gifted. So I went to, it's called the International Pectinid Workshop, which is essentially the International Scallop Conference that happens every few years. And all the scallop nerds in the world get together. And this one was on the Isle of Man. And of course, they give out, you know, like kind of joke awards at the end. And so, of course, the award that I received was least likely to need a microphone. And so with that award, they also gave me a book, which is about the history of the scallop as a symbol over time. And so I will look that up. Why is it a symbol for traveling pilgrims? Is that what you said?
Yes, yeah.
Okay. Oh, here we go. Thank you, David. Oh, David just messaged me that they use the shells to drink water and eat on the pilgrimage.
Oh, wow. Yeah.
Thank you, David.
We just come back from Santiago, and the shells are everywhere as you're walking the journey. Everywhere. It's beautiful.
So beautiful.
You showed a tremendous range in size of the little spat you were getting out of the spat bags. Is this due to the location of where they settled inside the spat bag, or do you think there's a genetic difference between the big ones and the little baby ones?
James, that's a really good question. I don't think it has to do with location of settlement within the bag, but it could definitely be a genetic difference, and it could also be a difference, essentially of when they settled in the bag, but not where. So, if a scallop down East Maine, if there was some portion of the population that spawned in August, and then some other portion of the population that spawned a month later in September, maybe that is what's, giving us those different size classes, but it could also be genetic. And we are trying to get some money to do some genetic work to parse some of those questions out.
Thank you.
And Phoebe, do again wild scallops grow slower than farmed ones? And what is it from spawning to an edible scallop? How long is that period?
Good question. So yes, there is generally a slower growth rate of scallops in the wild, and that could be for a couple reasons, because resources are different. Again, on the bottom, it might be different flow and access to food that can be influencing that. Can also be predation, right? They're putting more energy into those thicker shells. So they're needing to beef up their shell thickness wise, maybe not necessarily size wise, but thickness wise. And wait, so you said, is there a difference in growth between wild and cultured? And then what else did you ask?
No, from the start of from the spawn until an edible scallop. What's the
How long does
time?
it take? So in the wild fishery, you're not allowed to harvest scallops less than 101 millimeters, or around 4 inches. So that takes anywhere from 4 to 6 years for a scallop to grow that big. And in farm populations, they're trying to kind of go for a smaller market anyway in the meat. So most people are growing scallops on their farm no longer than 3 years. And they still are, they're in 3 years, they can get them to kind of that smaller size range that you would find in the wild population. Really good questions, guys. This is so fun. Oh, and
I have
David
another
also said, now it's just more of a decoration to wear on the pilgrimage in Spain, the scallop, but in ancient times it had a function for eating and drinking. Makes total sense. Very cool.
I'm on Nantucket or Cape Cod. The scallop shells are very, very pretty, especially when they're wet and they have ridges on them. So the ones I'm seeing in your pictures are more flat, brownish. What makes the difference in the shells?
Great question. So that's a different species. So the scallops that you're seeing down there are bay scallops. So bay scallops are a smaller scallop. They live in shallower waters. They have a 2-year life cycle. So they only last 2 years no matter what. And they're hermaphroditic. So they don't have sexual dimorphism. They're all hermaphroditic. And so they can kind of spawn whenever they want, and they can fertilize themselves basically. So they have a very different kind of like life history than our sea scallops. And that's one of the things that you notice right off the bat, is that the shells have ridges on the bay scallops. And some people
Thank
are
you.
growing bay scallops here in Maine, trying to see if they can grow them in aquaculture.
Thank you.
Phoebe, why do you think
Phoebe,
scallops are so independent and want their space?
Well, that sounds like a Jim Wilson question, actually, Alicia. I would expect that from Jim. That's a great question. I think they're distrusting animals. I think they have these big hard shells. They're very independent because they can swim and they can get away from things, and they don't need their conspecifics for anything but reproducing. And so if they need to move out of the way and go get different food or find a different habitat, they can just pick up and leave. And so yeah, I think they're pretty non-social in that way.
so Phoebe, you implied that there was genetic differences in the same lantern net. What could possibly create those genetic differences in a very local population?
Wait, you mean in the same spat bag?
Yeah,
I mean, I do think that there was some genetic work done back in the mid 2010s, that showed a place like Goldsboro Bay had very little genetic different. It was all basically, it looked like it was just a self-recruiting population. Whereas all these other populations along the coast, they had some mixture of Cobscook and Georges Bank and Casco. And so that there was input from these other populations happening along the entire coast. And so I think that within any one spat bag, right, you're getting inputs from these different areas because of circulation. That's what I would say. I would say that, you might have, our spat bags are in the water for around 7 months. So, if we put in a bag in September and took it out in October and maybe ran the genetics on that deployment, I wouldn't be surprised if those genetics were more similar to putting a bag in the water in October and taking it out in November. And then actually that might be a really good thing to do to really kind of try and understand where these populations might be coming from, where those spat might be coming from in any time-wise, I guess.
So you're kind of saying that there's a spurt of spat from one particular source at one time, and then another source at another time.
Maybe, because we're not really monitoring reproduction expansively along the coast. We don't know when they're spawning, but, it could also kind of go back to how densely populated these wild beds are, right? Thinking about like
Yep.
that message getting across to, hey, everybody, it's time to spawn. So if you have a densely populated bed, maybe that message is happening more quickly and everyone's spawning. Synchrony is happening.
Synchronously, yeah.
Yeah, but if scallops are more spread out, maybe that's not happening as quickly. So Jim, I might just have to try and do that little experiment to look at, the differences just even monthly genetics.
Yep.
What do you think? Is that what you were thinking?
No, I have no idea. I was just surprised when you mentioned the genetic differences in the same spat bag.
Yeah. Yep.
Phoebe, I have 2 questions for you. In your opinion, do bay scallops taste as good as sea scallops?
Ooh, never.
And then
And truthfully, I don't. I've collected bay scallops down in Rhode Island and been diving for them, and they're delicious, but you really can't beat a sea scallop. You really can't. They're so good. They're so sweet.
Phoebe, are spat bags made out of a kind of plastic? Is that what they're made out of?
That's a good question. And I used to know the answer to this, and I need to bring it back to the forefront of my mind. That's a great question. Yes, they are. And I don't know what kind it is.
No worries.
Yeah.
Do folks have any more questions for Phoebe, whether you want to put it in a chat box or just ask Phoebe directly? Bobby's starting to clap, so that's good. I got an answer. Spat bags are made out of polyethylene mesh.
Thank you.
Thanks, Sophia, or Sophie.
Sophie, I just said, hi, Soph. I just sent you a little chat there, Soph. Hi, Soph. Sophie is a fisherman as well. I don't know if there are any other fishermen on this call, but Sophie's a fisher out there doing this stuff.
Phoebe, this was awesome. I learned so much, and I would say that scallops are one of my favorite seafoods ever. So I just learned about why I love them so much. So thank you.
They're pretty cool. Thank you so much for having me. This was really fun.
Totally awesome. I so appreciate it, and it's lovely to see you all out there, and thanks for being a part of this and supporting the speaker series. So have a lovely night, everybody. Some of you, I'll see you soon, and thanks a bunch, Phoebe.
Yeah, thank you guys. It was really fun to see a lot of these faces too. So thank you.
Yes.
Good night.
Bye, Phoebe.
That's
Good
great.
night.